push on now to the third tier of wines. We have the third three wines, which is three different vintages of the Montebello. The 2009, which was just recently shipped to our collector members. And then the 2010, which is still in barrel, and the 11, which is still in barrel.
We just assembled in barrel. It's the baby here.
And people will have an opportunity to come and try the 11 Montebello at the upcoming barrel tasting as well. Right. So if people want to come, they do have the opportunity to taste this wine themselves.
And Eric showed it. You showed it in Washington,
D.C. last month.
Because that's the only other chance. And it is, admittedly, the first assemblage. So we'll go back in May. And with a couple of lots that were just so beautiful, but hadn't come around far enough to improve it. And so it's going to be just slight change from where you see it now, or we see it now, because unfortunately we weren't able to send these two out to.
That'd be a little difficult.
Yes. So it's a great series for us of 9, 10, 11 that it's been three of the cooler vintages in California, and yet in our poor soils and with our viticulture and our different climate from much of California, here in the Santa Cruz Mountains, we've got full ripeness and absolute incredible quality in all these vintages. And if you've seen the assemblage data on our website for the 11, it talks about the fact that once we come to this blend, we taste it against the 10, 9, 8, 7, and say blind, mix it in and say, okay, is it, as young as it is, yes, you can spot it, but does it have the basis for the complexity that these others have? Right. And so with the 11, that's where we are. So let's start in with the 9, Eric.
Well, 9, I mean, it was a cool, long winter, and suddenly it turned summer and was rather hot in the month of June, July, and that helped kind of get the vines back on schedule. So we were able to harvest in the month of sort of end of September, which begins really with Merlot. It's the first variety to bud out here and set its crop, so it's always the first to ripen on Montebello, and then it's followed by Cabernet Sauvignon, and then Petit Verdot, and then Franc, and then it kind of progresses from the bottom of the vineyard on up to the top. So it's usually a 5-week span of time to harvest all of Montebello. But in 2009, with that hot summer, the vines were able to catch up in a way that we were able to actually pull off getting all the fruit before the 13th of October that year. So it was early.
What was important about that day?
Well, we saw on the satellite and all the weather forecasts a big storm brewing over the Pacific. It was first a typhoon over Japan. It had caught another low pressure in the Gulf of Alaska and strengthened and came across the Pacific and slammed right into California.
And we knew this
with some force.
10 days in advance. Yeah. So anybody who, my feeling, anybody who had real experience in grape growing, wine growing, said, wait a minute, I really need to pick before this hits, because this is going to be 6 inches, 8 inches, disaster. And it's going to take my ripeness back down, and depending on the weather, it may never fully recover.
Right.
And so here, with our low yields, we had been picking along, and we were going to kind of be a little relaxed and take 10 days to pick.
Right.
Well, we looked at that and said, the grapes are ripe. Bring in our guys from up at Geyserville and Lytton Springs. Bring them down to help us part of the time. And because we use our full-time workers to do all of our picking.
Right.
And
they're
the families.
with us.
And the families.
Everybody's out
picking,
there. And so we picked all of the grapes fully ripe before that storm hit. And so for us, the 09 is just, got the
just
depth,
turned out amazing.
character. It's wonderful.
Yeah. So every vineyard parcel was selected or fermented separately, put to barrel for the natural malolactics, and then we came around in I want to say late January that next year, tasted through the lots, made our selection, and put together just a beautiful vintage of Montebello.
Yeah,
and partly because Bordeaux had done such a number on the 09 and some very good wines, and riper because of global warming and so on. and because of their decision to pick
wait.
late,
Yeah,
that they could wait, so they did.
Yeah.
But also the pricing and so on, which was unfortunate. Let's put it that way. It doesn't give people the chance, or as many people the chance to taste some of those famous wines as in my case I got to do when they were really reasonable. But so I added to what Eric had written. So probably some of the most arrogant words we've ever done, which was, in 10, 20, or 30 years, this Montebello 09 is going to stand up to any region in the world. And very arrogantly, we feel in those years, out there at 20 or 30 years, it's going to be unusual if any of the great Bordeaux's can surpass this. So it's pretty arrogant.
Well, and literally at a fraction of the price, too.
Oh, yes, of course. I mean, that's not the business we're in.
No.
So.
Yeah, well, here we are in a cooler vintage with the decision to pick before the rain, and still we get 13.5 alcohol, which is above our 20-year average.
The grapes were ready.
They were
There
ready.
was no reason to wait and take that kind of risk, like many of the folks in the North Coast who did. Suddenly, then they were facing, the grapes receiving 6 inches of rain, and then all the rot that ensued after the rain. It just became a real disaster.
Well, these cooler vintages, Paul, are really sort of putting a lot of producers in a bit of a pickle here in terms of, they're trying to reach these ripeness levels that are virtually unattainable in the current climate, really, aren't they? Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, and we don't know for sure, but a lot of the climate models show that the coast of California, which just not only includes us here at Montebello, very close to the coast at 15 miles, but even Napa, who is considerably inland. I don't. What would be the typical about 40
60
miles. But still, they're affected. Some of the climate models show that we are, in fact, going to be cooler.
Yeah.
And certainly these last 3 years, represented right here, Europe has been warmer, we have been cooler.
Yes.
And so it may be that what I'd love to see, and that is that we moderate these overripe wines and we get back to something that is somewhere between underripe and the overripe that's been the standard. And these 3 vintages are kind of forcing that. If this continues, a style more in this character is going to be what you can do consistently rather than see ups and downs in your style.
It's interesting, though, that even with the cool vintages that we've seen here at Montebello, that given the inversion layer and our location here, we're still able to get ripeness even in these cooler vintages.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because we're not carrying large crops.
Yeah.
And we're on top of making sure the vines are balanced for the season. So if it's a late start season, we always adjust down the yields even lower.
Right.
We drop more crop than I'd say, because we know that if it's a cool year, it's going to be difficult to ripen a big
And we
crop.
did roll out some reflective material this last year, and
Yes.
that helped.
We just got a
enhance
question, what is an inversion layer?
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Well, in our elevation, as the valley below us warms up, all that warm air will rise during the night into our region, our elevation point, and it becomes this cushion of warm air, and it keeps the nights warm, and then the days warmer.
Yeah.
So
We're
you could
literally above the fog.
Yeah,
And when the fog is down
as the
there.
fog comes into the valley, it kind of forces that warm air up to our elevation point.
So, people that have flown into San Francisco and seen, everything covered in fog and just the mountains above, we're above the
We're
fog.
above the
And
fog,
so
yeah.
we get that warmth, the sun comes up and we
Yeah,
have
and you
it
can see that
down
driving
there.
up Montebello Road in the morning,
Sure.
50 degrees at the base of the mountain and 70 degrees at the winery.
That's an
So
inversion.
that's the
That's an
inversion.
inversion.
Yeah.
Right.
Good. So 2010, Eric.
Okay.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, 9, we were still technically in drought. We had below average rainfall. Even though the winter was long, most of the rain actually that year came in the month of March, April. So it was late enough rain that the vines were able to kind of get through that hot summer and still had plenty of groundwater resources. 10, we were completely out of drought. It was this intense, wet winter here. Lots of just torrential storms. I think it rained every single day in the month of March. It rained during bloom, so yields were knocked down. And then summer was quite cool here. We didn't have much of an inversion layer here. But what saved us, or what allowed us to get, ultimately 13.2 alcohol in this wine, was some inversion, but that inversion came towards the end of the season.
Yeah. We were talking about the coolness of the 2010 vintage in Sonoma.
Yeah.
And obviously that had an impact on us.
And
here as
luckily,
well.
we were above those fogs that
Fogs,
were
yeah.
really
Yeah.
affecting the North Coast. So having elevation saved us in 2010. It kept the vines dry, but still the overall temperature was on the low side.
Right.
But then it was that late season warmth that really turned things around. That allowed the flavors of the grapes to suddenly develop to the point where they were ready to harvest.
And we were lucky that, what we grow on the North Coast is Zinfandel.
Right.
Yeah.
And that ripens sooner than Cabernet,
Yeah.
Right.
considerably. And so the cool season did not affect, yes, it had that disastrous effect in quantity, but it didn't affect
It didn't have
ripeness.
any
We
effect.
could get, with those warm days, we could get full ripeness.
Right.
Here at Montebello, we were up above those fogs, no problems. Great.
Yeah, and
vintage.
we weren't. We always pull leaves to some extent to make sure that the fruit has sunlight. But in the 2 days of intense heat that hit the North Coast, it was hot here, but not hot enough to cause any damage.
Sure.
Okay.
And our general strategy as far as winemaking is in Montebello, the case of this fruit, it contains a lot of tannin, so we are always very careful with the extraction. So just like the Grenache, the Syrah, it's all whole berry, destemmed. And in 2009, we actually remodeled the crush pad, put in conveyance system, and berry sorting equipment, so we were able to kind of pull out stem fragments or green berries from the fruit before committing it to the fermenter.
Right.
So we were fully utilizing that in 2010. And that was actually very beneficial because there was an uneven set that year. During bloom, there was some green berries that formed that were on the same cluster with the fully ripe berries. And so we really, we picked the fruit, but then resorted to sorting the green berries out manually.
Yeah. When you say, quote unquote, a challenging vintage, right?
It meant a very labor-intensive vintage,
Okay.
yeah, of
And,
getting
and
the
you know,
fruit
we haven't
picked and
mentioned
brought in.
this, but in 9 and 10 and 11, the worry with the weather, with the cold
yeah.
summers, you begin to say, wait a minute, is this ever going to get ripe? So, when we say difficult, it may have turned out beautifully with a lot of extra work, but also what was difficult was your level of stress.
It's the anxiety.
The anxiety.
It was a high anxiety vintage.
That's right. So even though it turned out so beautifully with a lot of hard work, there was that anxiety, and that adds to when people say it was a difficult vintage.
Well, our consumers don't feel any of that, right? They just get to enjoy
Hopefully
it.
just keep sitting there.
Well, it's our job to do all the work so we can get it to the bottle.
Right.
But it did turn out wonderful. This
Yeah.
wine has just got some incredible aroma.
Yeah.
It's been sitting in barrel now for about 16 months.
We'll go probably,
American
18?
oak, new oak. Nice diverse mix of, barrels from wood sourced from Appalachia, West Virginia to Ozark, Minnesota. And we will bottle it at the end of May.
At the end of May.
Yeah.
There we go.
In the May. All right.
Yeah.
Which is pretty typical. That's
Yeah.
no more or less. But it depends. We've gone as late as August.
Yeah, we have.
And we've been, I
Like
think, as
2003
early
we
as
went.
April or something.
With 99.
99.
Yeah.
So, but typical is end of May.
End of May is normal.
But we're
Okay.
tasting to say, has it come together? At what point is it ready to
go into the
go in
bottle. Okay.
Yeah.
And none of it required any egg white fining.
Nothing, yeah.
Again, it all
Right.
comes down to very careful fermentation,
Yeah.
doing carefully decided pump overs by taste. Initially, you do it because you want to get the natural yeast fermented, get oxygen to the juice. But then once the fermentation's active, and the cap's rising, there's lots of heat being generated by the yeast, they begin to extract a lot of color and tannin. that's when you have to really sit there and begin to really taste carefully and see how much tannin's entering the juice, the free run.
I would
to
imagine
then
watching
back off.
watching the press and press fractions is a big
Oh
part
yeah,
of
and
it.
that's very little press wines ever brought back into Montebello. Just the finest fractions will come in immediately into the free run, and then they go to barrel.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Well,
we're
you know, this is
extremely
a-
careful.
We should say, what is a press fraction?
Well, first of all, most of the world, it's first press, second press, and it's the pressure that's put
the
on
amount of
whatever
force,
kind of
that
press, the
extracts.
force that's put on those wet skins to extract it. And what we developed back in 97, 96, 97
we
really
created 7 different fractions that year.
That year
But-
was 7 fractions. We've limited it down to
it's 5.
5 fractions.
Yeah.
But there is a real difference between those 5 fractions, and the best of them, and sometimes never the first squeeze. The early
first
on.
squeeze is really just too liquid and herbal and aggressive, so it's the
But
largest
really-
amount of press wine as well.
Right.
And we have to get rid of it.
So if
We can't
anything
use
gets
it.
bulked out, that gets bulked out.
That's not going into Montebello or any of our wines.
No, not at all.
No.
But you end up with a lot of different lots now, where you start with 30 or 40 lots of wine coming from the mountain, and then you do add
have
the rest
the fractions on top of that.
5 fractions,
Yeah.
and you
Oh yeah,
keep
it's
those
suddenly you
separate.
have like 150 something barrels of all these different fractions.
try
And
to
so
put
we've
together.
got to taste those, get them together,
Yeah.
decide
Begin
what
to
goes,
consolidate
what
them
doesn't
down
go.
and-
Now, one thing to say about this whole thing that Eric mentioned about attention during the fermentation, a real difference between what we do at Montebello and Bordeaux, because a lot of our techniques are really 19th century California, 19th century Bordeaux techniques. We're not, I refer to as pre-industrial winemaking, because this is traditional winemaking where it transforms itself with a lot of guidance from us, experienced guidance. Okay, what we've gone on to do in Bordeaux, they extract, they do maceration, so on, and then they have to step in every year and find those tannins back.
Okay.
Because if you taste in Bordeaux the young wines, it's just, I am just shocked at the level of tannin. And with us, what we've decided is that in the fermenter, we'll do our damnedest to moderate, to keep those tannins within the
balanced
parameter.
tannin.
Yeah, so that they can go to bottle instead of having to be fine. And this is unusual, and Eric said that usually about 20% we early find because they've just gone over the level. They're great wines, but if we add them to the blend, they bring too much tannin, and so we find them early. But that's at most 20%. This year,
No,
nothing.
we
It was
try to
just-
avoid it when possible.
Yeah, and
so
this is
far,
really
nothing
perfect.
in the
So this is
11,
really the
10.
difference between doing it based on a formula and doing it based upon taste.
That's right.
Okay.
It's
No, we
no recipe.
avoid the formula.
Yeah,
other
I mean-
than it's the natural approach
Well, it's like,
to winemaking.
yeah, any chef, he's doing it by taste.
Okay.
And unfortunately, my wife is a great cook, but I'm not. And so I do Marcella Hazan, Italian recipe, and I have the book there, and I'm measuring exactly, and the kitchen is a mess.
Right.
And she's doing it by taste.
Right.
And there's no comparison. So what I say is, forget the recipes, do it by experience, by taste.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
You
you're
can
going to
make it.
have high tannin years, low tannin years.
Sure.
You have to quickly adapt to that.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's something we're seeing by taste. And
Sure.
we can adjust our pump over schedules, even do a period of no pump overs, but still circulate the juice below the cap to keep the yeast fermenting.
Okay.
And we'll do that until we're closer to dryness. And without having the sugar there, we can actually then taste and really see the true structure of the wine and do one last final pump over right at the very end, flesh out the wine, drain it, press it, and be satisfied.
This is something really that Eric has brought to winemaking at Montebello, and that is this idea of right at the end, having held back, we'll taste and say, okay, the tannins are under control, but the middle hasn't filled out. And so we'll pump over just for whatever it takes to do one turn in that fermenter.
Okay.
And we'll come back in 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and the middle has just filled out. We
And
stop.
yet the tannins are still
and the tannins are still
and then
balanced.
That's the moment
That's
you separate the
really,
free run,
really
press.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have one last wine here, and we're really right up against the clock, but we want to talk a little bit about the 2011 Montebello, and obviously another cool vintage.
Another cool year, yeah.
And looking
And
at
what
this,
was more difficult or challenging,
Right.
10 or 11? I mean, they both were, but in the end, the 11, just the weather saved us once again here at Montebello. Elevation, we were above the fogs, and we did have a little bit more rainfall to contend to or deal with during the season, but we had this 3-week window in the month of October to then fully ripen this crop.
yeah.
We got some early October rains.
Yeah.
But right after that, and this cool summer, so things were not ready
Right.
at that point. But those 3 weeks that Eric's saying,
3 weeks, yeah.
just beautiful. And we knew then, as that 3-week period ended, there were these early November rains coming.
Yeah.
And we said,
No, yeah.
just like 10, we said, no, and 9, no,
Yeah.
we're not. And I think we got 91% of the grapes.
91% of the grapes.
9% still out there. And we sort of said, okay, that 9% we can write off. And in fact, several of those guys,
actually
after that
went in.
second
Dried
rain,
out.
came in and,
Yeah, it
and
was
just
really
some beautiful wines.
those few storms at the end of October, early November. I mean, very minor amount of rainfall.
Unless you had been under the fogs.
Yeah,
And
that
the first
was-
time
yeah.
ever for Cabernet that I know in California, and you'll get people writing about this, the most in the North Coast for Cabernet, the most difficult vintage that anyone's seen, because they were under these wet fogs all summer,
Yeah.
as was our Zinfandel,
Mm-hmm.
but it ripens earlier. And so by trying to wait beyond that second rain, it was too much water even for Cabernet, which has a thick skin,
Yeah.
and there was a great deal of damage.
And there was a lot of humidity after that
Oh.
first October rain. Then suddenly things were
Yeah.
really at that perfect optimal condition for mildew.
So
And it just took off in a lot of the North Coast vineyards.
botrytis and the whole thing.
So this is one of these vintages where there's a danger of all of California being painted with this brush about what happened in Napa Cab.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
here we've produced a beautiful vintage
Yeah.
because of our different climate and different
Yeah.
philosophy. But I think people are going to be hearing a lot of negative things about the 2011 vintage coming up over the next couple of years.
Sure, absolutely. And a handful of people on the floor of Napa actually picked before that second rain. And even though the style was back to the style of the 96 or 95.
Early 90s,
Yeah, the earlier 90s. They made some beautiful wines, but it was literally a handful of people.
Yeah.
The people that waited through that second rain, the danger of being able to make the quality that they usually make was really great. So we'll hear a lot about this vintage.
Absolutely.
And quantities will be very limited, I'm
Yeah.
sure, out of the North Coast
I hope
because
that
there was a lot of
selection-
lost fruit.
Yeah, and I
We
hope
had
that-
a pretty reasonably sized crop here at Montebello. I mean, we had to drop fruit as
Yeah.
normal, do the green harvest, do the post-veraison kind of thinning out, and but we still, in the end, made this an average size production of Montebello.
Yeah.
And it is really made up of Cabernet Sauvignon. This year,
Yeah,
Cab
this is-
was the star of the vineyard.
87%.
87%.
And
this
the
year.
Merlot, which is typically 18 to 22%, would be the average
Yeah.
in there, is down to 9%.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it was not a Merlot vintage.
Yeah.
It was a
Yeah,
Cabernet.
Merlot just suffered too much from the difficult
Which is interesting
bloom
because
and
in
weather.
Bordeaux, in the cooler vintages, that's Merlot that usually
Often,
actually
yeah.
Yeah,
performs.
because it comes in early.
Yeah.
But
Merlot
was really set back this year by the weird spring weather that the vines experienced.
Yeah,
You know,
hard
they
to
bloomed
explain.
slightly behind Cab and didn't really set well, and they were just not enjoying the 2011 growing season.
Well, before we sign off here, what's
You guys
your
have any
what's,
questions or not?
Yeah, we do, but we're out of time.
We're out of time.
So
Okay,
can
sorry.
we say, Paul, what do you like to eat with your Montebello? What's your favorite thing?
I have a preference, which, I mean, just to pick two major dishes and without going into it, I'm for lamb with Cabernet, with the Bordeaux varieties.
Right.
And I'm with beef for Zinfandel. And of course, pasta and everything else. But, just to pick those two things that I really feel that with Zinfandel, beef is ideal.
Right.
If you have a good beef dish and you have a glass of Cabernet, glass of Zinfandel, see which one goes well. And with Cabernet, same thing. I personally have a preference for lamb.
Like rack of lamb, some rosemary
Sure,
and garlic.
absolutely.
There we go.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what made me change from being a vegetarian. That one day, early on, when I joined Ridge, I was a vegetarian.
Did Kathy do some lamb chops
We
or
did
something?
lamb at the winery. It was
that's
roasting out
right.
there in the front of the winery, drinking 91 Montebello, and that was in the air.
Change your life.
Oh, it did. In a good way. So, I'm not a vegetarian anymore. And I love lamb with Montebello.
That's
Okay.
it.
Well, thank you very much, Paul.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Eric. And
It's
thank
good to
you,
do
all of you
this.
out there, for
Yeah.
joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. We look forward
And
to
we'll
doing
try
this
to
again.
answer some of these questions that we got.
Absolutely. We'll do it
so,
online.
Good.
Okay.
Okay.
Very good.
Good.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thanks.